Hello, Bill.
Good morning, Bob. Welcome to the DMZ.
Did I do that the way Matt Lewis does it, or not?
I mean,
that was not very good, Matt Lewis imitation.
Well, Matt always starts. Matt and I have some chat before we start.
Right.
Matt is usually a little grumpy. If it's
I can
not,
do that.
If it's,
I can fill in. I can fill in for Matt.
With the exception of days when Trump makes a Supreme Court nomination, then he's got to spring into step.
Then the Mattometer is yeah. So I'm filling in. I feel so inadequate because there's so many. I am not like a cable news celebrity. I don't fly around staying in swanky hotels or whatever it is that cable news celebrities do.
Well, for folks who don't know, you haven't been formally introduced yet.
Oh, that's right.
You are Bob. You are Bob Wright.
Who am I, as a vice presidential candidate said a couple of decades ago? Who am I? Why am I here? This is a test of how old people are, whether they remember that. But go ahead, Bill. Introduce me.
You're Bob Wright. You are the founder of bloggingaz.tv,
right.
The home of the DMZ.
One of the stepping stones Matt used, although thankfully he still steps on it. We're grateful for that. He's a cable celebrity, but he hasn't forgotten his roots.
That's true. But despite your humble nature, I am obligated to say, happily so, you are the best-selling author of New York Times best-selling author of the brand new book Why Buddhism is True,
right?
Which everyone should be rushing out to buy right now from their favorite independent bookstore or online behemoth.
Certainly, if they were wondering whether Buddhism is true, and if so, why it's true, then this is the book for them. Yes, and it actually has been on the list for a couple of weeks now, and so I don't have major complaints.
So I do want to talk about that and a related project of yours later on in the show, but so I'm going to tease that for right now. But Matt is on his summer vacation. I believe his usual jaunt to Arizona. That's his favorite. When he wants to get away from the heat of D.C., he goes to the heat of Arizona. I believe he was there for the pardon. So we'll get to hear more from his sense of how Arizonians are reacting when he gets back. And we missed last week because I actually did the traditional Massachusetts vacation in Cape Cod, which was wonderful. As always, much has transpired since our last show 2 weeks ago. In fact, I wrote a piece just after the last show, which was after Bannon was forced out of the White House, which is why Bannon lost and the globalists won.
Good piece in Politico. Very good piece.
Thank you very much.
Great kicker. People should read it just for the final line, but you have to read the whole thing to appreciate the final line.
Without giving away the kicker, I'll tell you, when I write for Politico, when I write for different places, there's different cultures. Politico will lean very hard on you for a good lead and a good kicker. And this wasn't the case in this piece because I got the assignment at noon. Actually, like I think I read the email at 1 o'clock in the afternoon the day he left, and I rushed it and got it back to by 4 o'clock. But typically, since I work out of the house with the kids, I don't really write these long pieces till the evening. And I'll sit at the computer from 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. like, I need a kicker. They won't run this without a kicker. And, of course, your brain can barely function at that time. So I was happy that I was able to pull that out. But the reason why I was able to write that piece as quick as I could, because I had in the back of my head the lead for months, which is the sports writer of the New York Times, Mark Tracy, in December, in the interim period, spotted Bannon at the Atlanta airport for some reason, and he was walking around with a copy of The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam about.
You're close to giving away the kicker. We're in plot spoiler territory because this is a symmetrical kicker. Sometimes the kicker draws on the lead. I'm not going to say anything else because I want to preserve suspense. But go ahead, Bill. I didn't spoil your plot, man. I just pointed out that you were spoiling it. But go ahead.
It's rare that I get to talk about my own process. I'm going to take advantage.
Okay.
So the writer went up to Bannon like, "Are you Steve Bannon? Are you?" Really?
Yeah, like, no, I'm a homeless person. How many people in an airport? This was in an airport,
right? The Atlanta airport.
How many people look like Steve Bannon in an airport, right? No, most of them Most of them are better dressed.
So he introduced himself as a writer from the Times, and they struck up a conversation. He's like, "Hey, are you reading Best and the Brightest?" And Bannon says, "Yeah, I'm having everyone on my staff read it. It's a great way for showing how small mistakes early can lead to big mistakes later." When I first read that at the time, a part of me was like, "Wow, maybe these guys are really thoughtful in their way and are really thinking through how they're going to pursue a ambitious and game-changing agenda."
How has that thesis stood up over time?
I mean, that's sort of the point of my piece was that, Bannon came in with this very grandiose vision of realigning the entire political map,
right.
Premised on economic nationalism, challenging conservative orthodoxy, pushing trade protectionism and infrastructure. He said he wanted $1 trillion infrastructure program. He was going to build a coalition of 60% white and 40% black and Hispanic, and they would govern for 50 years. And he himself, Bannon, did none of that. I mean, the very first thing out of the gate was the travel ban, which is the last thing you'd want to do if you're trying to realign the political map. And infrastructure has never been fleshed out into a real proposal.
Well, and if you were going to do the travel ban, you'd just think a little more about the rollout, right? I mean, if you wanted to do it in the most politically palatable way, you would do that. And that, I mean, can I just insert a question? Is the deal with Bannon that he just thinks it's good to break shit? I really think that's part of his worldview. If you look at this like fourth turning cycles of history thing he's into,
right.
There's this idea that it's inevitable that there's going to be some kind of big conflagration. And I think it's maybe going to be global and involve the West versus the rest or whatever. But is part of the deal with Bannon that he just had this mindset that, heighten the contradictions. If it causes trouble, it may be political trouble in the short term for Trump, but trouble is good.
Well, there's reporting, it was in a PBS Frontline special on Bannon where people on the beat said the travel ban rollout was deliberately provocative. They intentionally did it on a Friday so there would be maximum protests on the weekend where people weren't going to work. So it's complete. So you're totally right. I think there is something that is innate to Bannon and probably Trump also, which is conflict is good, drama is good. But it totally flies in the face of Bannon's own stated goal of broader political realignment. So the right. Premise of my piece was because he was so attracted to that conflict and because he was so attracted to racial conflict that he obliterated his own desire to have a rainbow coalition centered around economic nationalism, and he couldn't execute on infrastructure, he couldn't execute on trade easily. Even they flinched on pulling out of NAFTA after the Secretary of Agriculture reminded Trump, "Hey, all that farm vote in the breadbasket, they voted for you, and they're going to get killed if you pull out of NAFTA." And Trump flinched. So what is not a spoiler as far as the kicker goes is that. So even though the globalist, quote unquote, and yes, I understand that's an anti-Semitic term, I'm not using it in the Bannon way. Folks like Gary Cohn are still there, and Bannon is not. That doesn't mean Trump's not going to act like an economic nationalist going forward because he is uncoachable and ungovernable. He loves drama and conflict, maybe even more than Bannon does. But the dream of such moves actually changing the political landscape, I think, is lost because the antipathy towards Trump is so deep, precisely because of how Bannon pursued the travel ban and the like going forward. So now, I know Bannon's a bit of a stale topic, but think about what's happened in the past week. We're hearing stories that Trump is angry with Gary Cohn, and Gary Cohn came out and complained about how Trump handled Charlottesville. And there's reports that there's friction between Trump and Rex Tillerson. So that would suggest that Trump is even more like Bannon today than the day that Bannon left. But on top of that, John Bolton has a piece in the National Review. Here is the ultimate foreign policy nationalist complaining he can't get in to see Trump face to face and can only share his views on how to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal by giving it to the National Review. So it's really hard. I mean, and I get that palace intrigue stories are kind of the reality TV show of the Trump presidency. In some ways, are not about actual policy. But in trying to understand what is making, there's always a difficulty in trying to get where is the overlap between what Trump says and what Trump does. And Trump talks like a bombastic nationalist, crypto racist most of the time, but certain policies, we're not bombing North Korea. We haven't pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. We haven't pulled out of NAFTA yet. A lot of that stuff is, humdrum status quo. And watching how the musical chairs are happening in the White House doesn't really shed a lot of light on the situation because they're going in both directions.
Well, but don't you think, that part is just consistent with the idea that Trump is fundamentally driven by short-term egotistical reactions to things, right? When Bannon was getting the headlines, that was bad. Obviously, if you were rationally deciding which advisors to keep and which not to keep, you would put at least some emphasis on the fact that Bannon warned against firing Comey and against hiring Scaramucci, whereas Jared Kushner gave horrible advice in both cases, and he's still around. Of course, he's the son-in-law. But I'm just making the general point that the quality of advice. Some people have said it's even a bad thing to give Trump advice that is borne out by future events if Trump doesn't follow the advice, because Trump is resentful of you being able to say I was right and you were wrong. But the general point is, I think the best map to Trump's behavior and the musical chairs game is not, well, we're agreeing, it is not ideology, right? It is, and the best alternative explanation is what pretty much everyone suspects, is that Trump he's like a 13-year-old kid. I
would add a wrinkle to that, though, because and this is maybe slightly altering what you said, but I hear a lot of, Trump's fundamentally a narcissist. He only cares about getting adulation and getting love from people and feeding his insecurities, and that's all that drives him. If it was just that, he's obviously a narcissist. I'm not quibbling on that point. Maybe the greatest narcissist we've ever known. But if it was just about getting adulation from the people, you would go kick the neo-Nazis in the teeth, because you would get love from everybody. The left would love you, the right would love you, the middle would love you, the media praise would be enormous. The only people who would complain would be neo-Nazis, of which they're not. Right. Maybe there's more than there should be, but they're not a majority. There's something that propels him to choose to get love from a faction of the country, the 35% of the country, when it's so easy to get love from more people. It's not hard to criticize neo-Nazis. This
leads to my theory that Trump's, if you want to attribute some kind of strategy to all this and argue that he's crazy like a fox, that the strategy is to avoid impeachment. If his base stands by him, there will almost certainly not be enough courage in Congress, political courage, to impeach him. Certainly not to the point of convicting him. And, if indeed it's the case that actually, given the, and I don't understand all this, but that the president is insulated from certain forms of prosecution, staying out of jail may, depending on what his financial, deeds in the past have and haven't been, staying out of jail may be tantamount to not being impeached, at least in the short term, right? So you could see his play. He's clearly, you're right. There is a play to my hardcore base element in a certain amount of this. And, pardoning Arpaio, and that's hardcore base, pardoning Arpaio, and so on. And there were good people on both sides in Charlottesville, which when you think about it is a significantly crazier thing to say than there were bad people on both sides. He wouldn't leave it at there was violence coming from the left, which may indeed be the case. Right. He had to say that in this very small group of extremists on the right, there were good people. But it's weird. And one explanation is it's an anti-impeachment strategy. Does that fit the data?
Oh, I think it does, but I think there's also the Occam's razor point that he's actually a racist, and therefore he's compelled to act upon his racist impulses.
Yeah, it's possible. I almost think it gives him too much credit to say that any actual belief of his, aside from, right, and anything that is close to an ideological belief, right, like white supremacy, anything is deeply governing in his case, like, I mean, for example, people say, well, if you go back, you can find that he's been sympathetic to economic nationalism for a long time, which may be true. And yet, as you note, that's not really coming to the fore. He didn't get out of NAFTA. I mean, after pulling out of the TPP, which either candidate, that was going nowhere anyway,
right,
in American politics.
That was a gimme.
Aside from that, he just hasn't done much, right? So if you look at beliefs he has supposedly held for a long time, they have not, as a rule, there's no, I don't have any reason to believe he's a belief-governed person. Now, you might argue that racism is more like an emotion than a belief, and that's why it's carrying weight. But I don't know.
But to your point about the impeachment protection program, which I certainly agree is true, whether it's by luck or by design, playing to the 35% is an insulation to impeachment. You won't get a bipartisan vote to impeach and let alone convict, so long as you have that hardcore base that can threaten primary challenges to incumbent Republicans. So when Nixon did the Saturday Night Massacre, he did it knowing it would probably lead to impeachment. But this was in one of the Woodward and Bernstein books about it. So they cited people anonymously saying who understood Nixon's mind. So take it with a grain of salt if you wish. But this is what they reported: that he knew he could lead to impeachment, but he believed that letting the special prosecutor ignore his guidance was making him look weak to the Soviets and Middle Eastern countries, and he couldn't let that stand to function as the commander-in-chief. So in that telling, there's an element, I mean, it's warped, but there's an element of, I need to do this to do my job. Even though I'm risking losing my job, I can't do my job unless I do this. Trump has, I would argue, almost zero interest in governing. He's not focused on signing legislation.
Apparently not.
Right. I mean,
well, there's legislation he'd like to say. He'd like to be able to say he repealed Obamacare. He doesn't have a clear idea of what that should mean or what. I mean, but anything that fits that description, he'd like to be able to say that.
I think he was just as happy having a Rose Garden ceremony for the House bill that didn't get sent to his desk, and then punch Mitch McConnell in the face when he doesn't get out of the Senate to say, "Look, I'm draining the swamp. I'm not part of the Republican establishment." I mean, it's not like he really is working that hard to find the middle ground, work the compromise, flesh out the policy details, solve the procedural challenges. He's not doing any of that kind of stuff. Right. And tax reform, there's a tax reform speech he's giving today, but there's still no actual tax reform proposal. There's no infrastructure proposal. They're walking into keeping the government open this month, and Trump is stamping his feet about the border wall when everybody knows that's a recipe for shutdown. So I see little evidence that he's trying to govern.
Yeah, but on the other hand, if he were trying, I mean, is it that he's not? I think there's a lot of this he would kind of like to do. But one thing people said from the beginning is this is going to be chaos. This guy has never run an organization of any size, and this is the whole federal government. He has no experience with legislation. And the small organization he did run was characterized by chaos, right? I mean, by backbiting and him playing people off of one another. So, I mean, I just don't know to what extent this has to do with his preferences in terms of legislation being passed and things happening, and just his sheer incompetence. I mean, and he's an incompetence that is exacerbated by his perennially being caught up in how the news cycle is reflecting on him personally, right, and what he can tweet in response to that, right?
Well, it's hard to fully separate the incompetence and the narcissism, but to circle back to the Nixon point, what I'm trying to get at is his interest in attacking party leadership it helps him with the base they don't like McConnell, they don't like Paul Ryan, they think they're soft and squishy, think they're part of the swamp. You wouldn't attack them frontally if your primary interest was to get their assistance in passing legislation.
Right.
You do it because, one, you're just emotionally attracted to conflict and drama, but also does help in a way with impeachment protection because it riles the base up and it scares those in office of getting crosswise with the base. So you're going to have on September 26th, 4 days before the deadline that the government could shut down, the special election primary runoff in Alabama against the incumbent Senator Luther Strange, who's McConnell-backed and nominally Trump-backed, with the insurgent Judge Roy Moore, who most people think has the advantage here. And this is going to be against the backdrop of a showdown over the wall, where I doubt Luther Strange is going to express support for anything that would not include funding for the wall. So you have a lost vote potentially for keeping the government open. But if Moore is attacking Strange as part of the swamp, couldn't repeal Obamacare, too close to McConnell. McConnell, of course, has said for years he won't shut down the government. So whatever Strange says, Moore will likely yoke Strange to McConnell on that point. And if Moore wins, that scares the daylights out of everybody in the Republican Party. In Alabama, in the deepest, no matter how deep red a state you represent, you could get ousted for being part of the swamp.
So you're saying this is a strategy that could conceivably succeed in getting Republicans in Congress to bend to Trump's will?
I mean, I think it's going to be very, very hard for Republicans to break with Trump over the wall specifically, despite the fact that the potential government shutdown, despite the possibility for a debt default, which is really calamitous. Yeah. Because it's going to be happening 4 days after, possibly, I might even say probably, Moore beats Strange.
Yeah. Well, I want to say something about this, but first I want to insert a question. Do you think it would be smart in sheerly political terms for the Democrats? I guess the answer is no, as I think this through. But it seems to me it would be kind of rhetorically powerful if they said, we can do a wall if you stick with your promise that Mexico and not the American taxpayers will pay for it. If Mexico will say, yeah, we're paying for it and give us the money up front, fine, but we are not going to stick this on the American taxpayers. I mean, it seems to me in some respect, of course, there's all kinds of complications in saying, yeah, we can live with a wall, but I'm not sure it's being adequately emphasized that he wants to, in some sense, the consequence is to, in some sense or another, put this on the American taxpayers. And it just seems to me any way you can really highlight what a violation of his campaign oath this is. Yeah, would be good.
I think you can make that point without sounding sympathetic to the wall. I mean, you can just say, literally day one of the Trump campaign was, we're going to build the wall, Mexico's going to pay for it. It was the centerpiece of day one. Right. And to then say, well, you're going to pay for it, and Mexico will pay us back later, trust me. I mean, that's straight up, I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. That is pretty wide open for mockery and attack on the Democrats' part. I mean, they could be saying, this is just a straight up con. He told you would not pay for this, and now he's threatening shutdown of the government over making you pay for it with a false promise that they're going to pay for it later, where Mexico is repeatedly saying they will not.
Yeah, well, I just want to hear a lot of that, I guess, is all I'm saying. But on the other point, on his kind of playing hardball with people like McConnell, there's, two kind of other explanations. One is it's become instinctive. I mean, famously, this is one thing his mentor, Roy Cohn, taught him, right? Always punch back twice as hard. But there's also the possibility, and I think you mentioned this in your Real Clear Politics piece.
Good segue.
About, yeah, well, thank you. You should have me on more often. I'm here to plug your stuff. Matt's good about that too, I will say. I don't claim to rival Matt Lewis in this department. You did this piece partly about, well, will the Democrats break up, to the extent that the Republicans might, in terms of primarying their incumbents and so on, people on the left, there are groups starting to form and so on. But I think it's in that piece, correct me if I'm wrong, that you mentioned that Trump is showing signs of like running against Congress the way Truman did, but of course Truman was running against the Congress of the other party.
Right.
And so a third explanation here, it seems to me, is Trump is already realizing, look, nothing is going to get done. All my campaign promises are going to look like they were broken, so I'm going to have to blame a Republican Congress, and that's what I'm going to do for the next 3.5 years.
Right, and there's a certain surface logic, and that might help you win re-election because you're separating yourself from the morass of Washington. It's a terrible strategy to keep control of Congress in the midterm. Again, if you cared about passing legislation, you wouldn't go that route.
Right, but we know that Trump cares about nothing more than, remaining at the center of attention and staying out of jail.
Right.
So, it seems to me it could be this. I mean, these are two kind of contrary explanations. One is I can get Republicans to do the things I want them to do by playing hardball. The other is I'm not going to ever get them to do the things I want them to do. I just want to be in position to blame them for not doing the things.
So to fully pivot to what's going on with the left, which I think will bet both my self-promotion and yours, Trump is leading a circular firing squad. I mean, you could ask for a more ridiculous midterm election strategy than that. So it is served up on a platter for Democrats to unify and triumph over the divided Republican Party in the midterm election, except for the fact that Democrats are, if not equivalently divided as Republicans, certainly suffering levels of division.
Would you say that Dems are in disarray? This was people of a certain age may not remember this, but this was like a decade ago, a cliche joke about this recurring headline: Democrats in disarray.
Well, what's interesting is that congressional Democrats are not in disarray. They have been locked tight. I mean, you have 11 Democratic senators from Trump states. Not a single one broke over the Obamacare fight. You don't have anybody threatening to break ranks over the border wall fight. I mean, there are plenty of Democrats. I mean, out of those 11 Senate Democrats, 10 are running for re-election in 2018. These are senators in Ohio and Missouri and Montana and Indiana and North Dakota. These are folks who might be pretty susceptible to an anti-immigrant pitch, and there's no sign of them breaking ranks yet. So you don't see it at that level. You do see it at the activist level. You have two newer groups, Justice Democrats and Brand New Congress. They've sort of formed into a rough alliance, and they're informally backed by the Young Turks online TV show to raise money to fund primary challenges, not just against incumbent Democrats, but a good number of them are going at incumbent Democrats, and some of them actually quite progressive incumbent Democrats. It's more on the principle that we need people even farther left of anybody in Congress, and anyone in our way, is fair game. Now, they don't have a lot of challengers yet. They only have about 5, so perhaps they're more talk than action at this point. You also have looming on the periphery is Our Revolution, which is the group that Bernie Sanders founded. They had a leadership change because Bernie founded it, but he doesn't run it. But his right-hand man, Jeff Weaver, was the president. He was recently replaced by Nina Turner, the former state senator from Ohio, who was a surrogate during the Sanders campaign. She has been much more provocative and confrontational against establishment Democrats since she took over. She has said publicly, we're not going to have unity for unity's sake. After Chuck Schumer released his better deal economic package, which got a lot of praise from economic populists because it had a very strict anti-monopoly focus. Nina Turner's group, Our Revolution, said, this doesn't have single payer, this doesn't have expansive free college. We have our people's platform. We're going to march to the DNC with our petition signatures and give it to them. They were not allowed to enter the DNC building. They were met on the steps and given donuts and coffee, which Nina Turner took as a patronizing gesture, spoke on the steps and chastised them, went to BuzzFeed afterwards and called them dictatorial, out of touch. But as of yet, Our Revolution has not endorsed a Democratic challenger to an incumbent congressional Democrat. They might. There's still time. But at minimum, you're hearing voices in the progressive community that are very dismissive and angry towards incumbent Democrats and establishment Democrats. And as we learned in 2016, it doesn't take that much division on the left to cause problems. No. They may not be divided down the middle as much as Republicans are, but when you have a Senate map that is really skewed against Democrats for 2018, you have 10 Democrats incumbents running in red states. You have only one Republican incumbent running in a blue state and one Republican running in a purple state, and you need 3 to take back the Senate. That makes things very hard. Dave Wasserman at 538 had an analysis of the House map, saying the median House seat, which if you rank all the seats from most Republican to most Democrat, the one in the middle is decidedly more Republican than the presidential popular vote, one of the widest gaps in history. So that is reflective of how hard the House map is for Democrats. Even if they pick up some seats, they need 24. Getting that might be very difficult. So even the slightest bit of division might get in their way. And there's almost no way you're going to resolve these tensions before the midterm election, let alone the presidential primary, where you're going to have 15 plus Democrats battling it out, populist versus establishment, and many of other gradations in between.
Okay, so let me ask you a question. I mean, you clearly seem to be counseling against getting too ambitious on the left, right? But what, I mean, if you agree that Trump was speaking to some real grievances in Middle America, right, and that Bernie was speaking to some of those grievances, which is one reason that I think he might well have won, but not only because of that, also because so much of Trump support grew out of Hillary hatred. But in any event, I think Bernie could have won. So I think this grows out. You know, the kind of insurgency on the left grows out of an accurate belief that something was going on with the Bernie campaign. Now, you may say they misdiagnosed what the source of his appeal was, but I guess the question to you is, doesn't both Bernie's level of support and Trump's support suggest that there's something in America, maybe largely Middle America, that establishment Democrats are not addressing? And if you think that the answer to that is to any extent yes, what should the Democratic establishment be doing to address it, and possibly, conveniently, in the process, neutralizing what you see as, I think you see as, a kind of a dangerous insurgency on the left?
That's a very complicated question.
Thank you. I'm going to now take a nap while you answer. I needed a break, and so I thought I'd ask you. I'm going to keep you busy for 5 or 10 minutes.
You know, I wrote a piece after the election called "No, Obama probably wouldn't have won," which was an argument, and I'm not saying definitively Obama wouldn't have won, and there's a perfectly strong argument that, hey, it was only 90,000 votes in 3 states, and Hillary had a lot of baggage, and Obama was an expert campaigner, and he could have yanked that out. I'm not saying that's not possible. The broader point is there was clearly a backlash forming in white, non-college educated America, concentrated in Rust Belt states. No matter who won, that was a real backlash. No matter who the Democrats nominated, that was a real backlash. And how much of that was economic and how much of that was race and cultural, you can debate all day long. There's clearly elements of both. And I mean, there's plenty of anecdotal evidence and statistical evidence that white non-college distaste of Obamacare was racially motivated. You know, there are people who had expressed whites who expressed racial grievance before Obama was elected, who supported universal health care. Those numbers went down after Obamacare. It's a very clear, and you see lots of rhetoric around. You're taking my money, you're taking my Medicare money to give to those people and their Obamacare. Wink, wink. So that's sort of an area where the economics and the race come together. Mm-hmm. The Bernie would have won argument, I would say, is premised on this was a populist moment, and if we nominated a non-racist populist, we could have beaten the racist populist.
Let me just insert that my Bernie would have won theory is premised partly on the idea that a lot of the election was about people hating fake-seeming politicians, which Hillary struck them as.
Sure.
And Bernie doesn't strike people that way. That's part of it, but that's just an asterisk.
Right.
So now go ahead.
But sort of along the same lines, that Trump had all these distasteful qualities. He's a narcissist. He's a racist. He's divisive. He's provocative. If you had someone else who was shorn of all those negative attributes, a cleaner, fresher populist, not tied to the establishment, right on the economic issues, that person would have won. And maybe, but there's certainly a possibility that.
Although, by the way, I'm saying that some of those things about Trump that you would have shorn him of, that was part of the appeal, because he couldn't possibly be a politician and be an asshole in so many ways, because politicians try to conceal the fact that they're assholes. Right. Okay, anyway, go ahead.
Well, and maybe that's the long and short of it, but there's also the possibility that Trump bashing immigrants and bashing Black Lives Matter was integral to that populism, and you can't separate out of the economic elements of it, and Bernie was never going to out-racist Donald Trump in that score. So if you think that was integral, then the Bernie would have what argument doesn't wash. But that's the debate that's still going on now. What was the problem, and what therefore is the solution? And since, unlike say McGovern losing, when McGovern lost, the sort of general consensus of Democrats went too far left, we need to have a Southern moderate next time round. Or when Dukakis lost, we can't have a Massachusetts liberal, we need another Southern moderate. You don't have that consensus on the left now, in the Democratic Party in general. Whose fault is it? Is it the establishment, or is it the Democratic Socialists? Was this an economic issue, or is this a race issue? Now, you have Trump's support dropping from, he got 46% in the election. His approval is at about 35% now. So there's some 10%, it's kind of soft Trump vote. And I assume, based on what Chuck Schumer did with his Better Deal package, which was economics only, there was no climate change in there, there was no racial equality in there, there was no LGBT issues in there. I'm not saying that means Democrats have given up on those issues, but clearly the foot that that Schumer wanted to lead with was economic. And I can only presume that their data shows that in that soft 10%, their economic issues have a lot of resonance there. Now, right after Schumer did that, you had the transgender military ban, and then a few weeks ago you had Charlottesville, which immediately sucked up all the attention. So you can say, in a vacuum, sure, it would be great for Democrats to really hammer those economic populist issues, but there's just no getting around the fact that race, not just race, organically comes up. You have a president actively, fanning those flames, which, Steve Bannon was saying in his, near exit interview. I hope Democrats talk about identity politics all day long, and then we'll talk about the real issues. Trump doesn't talk about the real issues. He talks about race too. So there's just no getting around dealing with that, and that makes things very complicated for Democrats trying to craft an agenda that has narrow appeal to wayward Democrats or wayward swing voters, who I can only conclude get their backup when you talk about things like white privilege, because they say, I'm not privileged, I'm having a hard time, my way of life is being taken away from me, and I don't feel like I'm very privileged right now. But you can't have Democrats not talk about the Confederate statues in the U.S. Capitol, because someone's going to, and you can then hem and haw about it and say, well, I don't think that's a symbolic issue and it's really not bread and butter. People are going to then take that as a signal that you don't care about racial equality, and that's going to be a problem. So there's just no clean, pat answer to how Democrats resolve these internal differences. It's really just a question of muddling through, I think, and keeping those divisions as contained as possible relative to what Republicans are going through themselves.
Yeah, okay. One kind of related question is Steve Bannon, one thing he was advocating was higher taxes for the rich, right? When he was in the administration. Briefly. And I thought, this gets back to the idea that the original fear from some of us was that the Republicans were going to succeed in a party realignment. And they were going to appeal with things like that to some Trump supporters in Middle America, keep them on board, and maybe even expand that base. But when he started doing that, I thought, if Steve Bannon is getting more, if the person getting the most headlines for proposing taxes on the rich is a Republican, what does that say about the Democrats' message? Now, you tell me, can they not really make a big deal? I mean, maybe they are advocating it, and I don't know. Or is it, to some extent, they can't really wholeheartedly advocate something like that because of the donor base? Or because they actually don't think it plays at the level of popular support?
You go back to Obama's first term, right before 2010.
Right.
There was, because this is when the Bush tax cuts were about to expire. And if they did nothing, they would have expired at the end of 2010, and taxes on the wealthy would have gone up, and the middle class would have gone up simultaneously. So this is when they controlled both houses of Congress. They had 59 votes in the Senate. This is after Scott Brown took Kennedy's seat. You certainly had a decent shot of putting a bill on the floor that would say we're going to let the Bush tax cuts for the wealthy alone expire and keep them for the middle class. There were Democratic senators who told Harry Reid, and forgive me if I'm insulting somebody, but my memory serves, they included Barbara Boxer in California and Maria Cantwell in Washington State. These are states with a good chunk of wealthy liberals. Mm-hmm. And they told Reid, don't make us vote on this before the midterm. This is a polarizing subject. It's not a good time to do it. And so they didn't. Then after the midterms, well, they lost anyway, you had Obama cut that deal with Republicans to extend all the tax cuts for 2 years, push that fiscal cliff to the end of 2012, which at the time Bernie Sanders got on the floor and called it a massive sellout, held the floor for 10 hours or so in a quasi-filibuster. And people, well, if you caved on it now, you're going to cave on it forever. Well, Obama won re-election, and he didn't cave. And they squeezed Republicans, and they ended those Bush tax cuts in that fiscal cliff deal for the wealthy, mostly. But it does show that, sure, on the surface, soak the rich is a perfectly sound political message. You pull that, it's going to pull just fine. But there are complications within that, because there are wealthy liberals, there are wealthy donors, and a lot of those wealthy donors do not like Donald Trump very much, and so they don't care for economic nationalism or anti NAFTA talk.
Right. Sort of which may put Democrats in a stronger position in advocating something like that, because the people who they would worry would desert them if they propose taxes on the rich cannot afford to desert them. So on, you could make that argument. The other thing I'd say is that the reason they called them party realignments is you lose some, but you gain some.
Right.
Now, and in this case, you'd be gaining. It seems to be in principle, if the Democrats said to middle Americans, look, Donald Trump said all this stuff, he ain't doing it. Here's what we want to do. We want to have higher taxes on the rich, and these coastal elites who have contempt for you, they wouldn't say that, of course, but, if you can send that subliminally, fine. And we're going to use it to, help with your crumbling infrastructure, provide whatever, vocational training, opioid treatment, whatever laundry list you want, make it a coherent package. We're actually going to help you, and we're going to get the rich people to have plenty of money to pay for it. If you could make that an appealing message, you could pick up a lot of votes. Now, I grant you that the people you're losing are people who donate more money to campaigns than the people you're gaining. It's just not impossible that the calculation could make sense. And I guess one question I have for you is this what they're planning? These leftist insurgents? Is that the idea?
Well, to your point, there's definitely time. Like Obama did raise taxes in the fiscal cliff. He did raise taxes on the wealthy as part of Obamacare. And so you're at the end of his administration, you were left with the most progressive tax code since before Reagan. But in both cases, they were done kind of subtly. It wasn't. It was not in your face, and they had it. And there was a lot of jiu-jitsu that had to go on before it could happen.
I remember.
Another example I think of where tax increases actually worked was Governor Mark Warner in Virginia. Here's a guy who's considered a blue dog Democrat, centrist Democrat, but he actually raised taxes as governor but tied to specific improvements. Your money is going to go to X. And there was a strong sense that where he said, "Look, we've cut a lot of spending. We've tried to keep taxes down. We've done what we could to be fiscally responsible. We really need to do this now to give you things that you want." And he had the credibility to make that case. And so there's a way to do it, but I think there is an underappreciated obstacle with a full-blown soak the rich message. I mean, in theory, look, it's them and not me. So why does it?
Right.
But
what is the underappreciated obstacle? I mean, the obvious obstacle is donor base, but
there's donor base, and there's two, a sense of where does it end? You're saying today it's just them, but I don't have the confidence that you have the ability to restrain yourself and limit the tax increases and limit the spending to where it's really going to help me. If you're pushing single payer, free college, $1 trillion plus infrastructure, universal preschool, well, where does it end? You're giving away the store, and I don't have the trust in you that's not going to eventually land on my shoulders at the end of the day. That's where I think it gets complicated.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's insurmountable. Well, anyway, that's an interesting.
It's surmountable.
Yeah.
But I think that the surmounting is in some limitation of the ambition.
Oh, sure, and there should be that. I mean, for example, the even Bernie's idea of free college for everyone, that was his, right? Like, I'm not sure how many people who supported Trump think that's what they lack. I mean, I think a lot of them might rather have a year of excellent vocational training or something. I mean, I just don't know.
There's research on this. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a clear animus against college amongst the white working class.
Right.
I mean, and Democrats have done focus grouping and polling. They've tested, what polls better, free college, or some people shouldn't have to go to college, or some people college isn't right for everybody. That polls better than free college for everybody. Now, as a policy matter, I am 100% free college. I think vocational education is fine in itself, but the notion that you would push vocational education and deprioritize college education, I think, is totally wrong. Like, all evidence shows that people have better earning potential with college. That is where the global economy is going. I think you're limiting people's opportunities and choices if you're not pushing them in that direction. Having said that, that is clearly politically wrong as of this moment without some sort of larger educational campaign going on. So offering the store to everybody, I mean, that makes certain people in the Rust Belt say, you're not speaking to me and what my needs are. I mean, I might be for a tax increase if I feel it's going to help me directly, but I don't have kids, or my kids aren't welcome. I don't care about universal pre-K. I don't care what the next generation and how that looks. Help me right now.
Things like healthcare could have appeal. But anyway, okay, so that's my periodically voiced aspiration on.
But the shift to your latest project, which is also related to what's going on the left.
It is, I guess.
So you have started an organization?
Oh, it's I have an organization. It puts out blogging heads and so on, and it's a nonprofit. And this is part of that.
So it's a project within the current.
It's called the Nonzero Foundation, but the project is called Mindful Resistance. The URL is mindfulresistance.net. What that actually materially consists of now is a place you can sign up for a weekly newsletter we're doing called the Mindful Resistance Newsletter. The idea, no, bring them on, man. This is blogging heads. Don't shush them.
Hello. Here's my youngest.
And what's your youngest name?
Here's Simone, who
Simone can't hear me because you've got earbuds, right?
Simone can't. This is my friend Bob.
Hi, Simone.
So my older one, who I think fans have seen before, she started third grade today. But Simone's got.
This is a new level of family intimacy.
Yes.
This is. I'm liking this. I mean, you're fine to look at, Bill, but I do think we've just seen an improvement here in in the sheerly visual aesthetics.
So she starts kindergarten in a few days. So she has a few days to interfere with my work schedule.
She's doing an excellent job.
So I know your children are grown, correct?
You might say yes. They're both.
So
in fact, I just want to say quickly. One of them just phoned in from Shepherdstown, West Virginia, which is where Matt Lewis's alma mater is.
Right.
She got a grant to largely walk across the country, talking to people. She'll take a few buses, but and turn it into something called spoken poetry. But I digress.
She's the reason why Trump won, right?
Well, maybe she'll be able to shed some light on why Trump won. But anyway, so we have kids. You have many adventures ahead. I can confidently.
But this cleaning this stage. I mean, both my 5-year-old and 8-year-old are still all over my body all the time. When does that end? What is there a year where that ends?
First of all, you're going to miss it when it ends.
That's what people say. I have a hard time believing that right now.
Live in the moment. Be mindful of this, Bill. Live in the moment. Be here now. Savor it, because it's going to be like that. And all of a sudden, she's going to be walking across the country, phoning in from Matt Lewis's alma mater.
Right, it's been eight painful, slow years. Every day, they're in my business. So I can't see this ending quickly, or feeling like it ends quickly.
You'd be surprised.
Okay. I think, Simone, you're going to go upstairs now, okay? But like other parents, other dads, leave their houses and go to offices.
First of all, I just want to say we just set a record. That was the degree of hair tousledness, everything.
The quantity of saliva on my head.
Quantity of saliva, quantity of airtime. This makes that BBC guy look like, a total amateur. So that was good, but it will pass more quickly than you realize.
All right, I'll take your word. But
you will be old and wise like me before you know it.
I need some mindful resistance to my children. So tell me how that works.
Okay, so no, what you need is mindful appreciation of your children. But as for Trump. Mindfully resisting, and I would say not so much Trump as the generic forces he represents. I mean, after all, Trump, I think, will someday be gone, and yet some of the problems that brought him to the surface will persist. Political polarization, the psychology of tribalism, and I guess a lot of the idea of mindful resistance is that the psychology of tribalism is pervasive. We all suffer from it to some extent. And those of us who would like to resist Trumpism will be better equipped to do it if we are more aware of how the psychology of tribalism influences us. Because that psychology can lead to, among other things, overreaction to Trump's provocations that have downsides. I mean, they distract us from actually dealing with the issues. To the extent that there were issues behind the grievances that got him elected, it distracts us from dealing with those. And also sometimes the overreaction just plays into his hands. More than we realize, our being outraged feeds the narrative that fuels his base. And I'm not saying, you obviously, it's a tricky line to walk, and I don't have some magic formula, between, on the one hand, calling attention to his ongoing violation of important norms, which you have to do. Raising a voice in protest when he pardons somebody like Joe Arpaio, which you have to do. Doing that on the one hand, not abandoning your values, but on the other hand, asserting your values in a way that does not play into his hands. It's a challenge, and I don't, this is not, mindful resistance does not have some kind of specific ideology like, okay, Democrats should do this, this, and this. It's just more like trying to call attention to things that we think anti-Trumpers may be doing that help Trump, and just making them aware of how things play in Trump's base, how our behavior is being perceived in Trump's base. Just be aware of how it's being processed, and then make your own decision as to whether you think it's worth it. So it's things like that, and being aware of how, and this is a big part of mindfulness meditation, although mindful resistance is not only for people who meditate, But I will say that I was led into this partly by my getting into mindfulness meditation, and which, one manifestation of which is the aforementioned book. But one thing mindfulness meditation does is make you more aware of how your feelings are shaping your behavior and your thoughts. So like classic thing we've all done, spread something that is in some sense fake news by clicking retweet or share. If you pay attention, you're doing that because it feels good. It's not a strictly cognitive process. Whenever you share something, promulgate something that you actually haven't inspected yourself, you actually can't vouch for its accuracy or validity, but you share it anyway, there's a feeling making you do that. And I think it's just good for people to be aware of their feelings. And if you reflect on it and go, no, I should share it anyway, fine. But I also think that our doing that, sharing or retweeting too casually, that can also play into Trump's hands in certain ways. So anyway, I don't know if this sounds, I don't know, how does this sound so far? You think I got a winning message here, Phil?
Oh, I mean, I think what you're doing is very important. I also think that you're entering a very fraught political space.
Yeah.
There's people get very attached to their activist strategies, and particularly in more devout progressive quarters, they take very badly suggestions that they're not doing it right.
Yeah.
So there's a likelihood of you getting some backlash from those folks. So is your intention to try to get them to change their ways and to directly challenge them to do so, or is it
it's mainly literally to be more mindful, to be more aware of how their feelings are governing their behavior, and more aware of the consequences of the behavior. How's it playing in Trump land? Is it energizing his base? Then make your own decision. I mean, in terms of things we have explicitly editorialized against, the only thing there is the Antifa philosophy of sometimes actually initiating violence as opposed to self-defense, actually going out and initiate, Nazi punching. We are against that. And I mean, it's illegal. It's one of the things you supposedly are fighting fascism because of, right? It's because fascists would favor physical intimidation to suppress speech and violating casting the rule of law aside. And I also think it's counterproductive. So on all those grounds.
Well, as you talk about feelings, so how does very few of us actually Nazi punch? Right,
but a lot of people
share
are not against it,
right.
even kind of support it. And
so if you share a Nazi punching video or GIF and cheer it on, and you're doing it because it's emotionally satisfying to you to see a Nazi get punched.
Perfect example, because it is so emotionally satisfying. Right. Who does not want to see Richard Spencer get punched? Right?
What is the practical impact of that action?
Well, I think in that case, I just think, the general principle is that this kind of publicity is what these guys want. It helps them expand the idea that they are being attacked, right? That they are not the ones starting the violence, helps their recruiting. And in fact, I heard on some podcast from some expert that, the armed militia guys who showed up at Charlottesville, they showed up there specifically because of Antifa, because they are in an awkward position, apparently, because they've always been anti-government. Suddenly their guy is in the White House. So their key recruiting message can no longer be the feds are going to come after you. Now it's these Antifa guys who commit violence against peaceful protesters. So that actually is drawing. That's a recruiting message not just for the white supremacists per se, but for the armed militias. Okay.
So there's an arms race going on. There's an
there absolutely is. And where does that end? By the way, eventually a gun is going to get fired if this keeps up. And then what does Antifa do? So anyway, but the point is, that's the only thing the other thing I did a little note on you can call this an editorial, was there was a thing in this NPR show, Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, where, the show, it's like funny and so on. And of course, they're anti-Trump, which is fine. I mean, that part's fine. But they did this little joke where they said, most of the counties in the path of the eclipse of the sun are Trump-supporting counties, which is ironic because the last thing they want is to make America darker. And then somebody on the panel, this was all scripted, I think, said, well, but fortunately, they don't believe the eclipse is real. And I just made the point. I just made the point, bear in mind that one of the things that got Trump elected is the belief in middle America that coastal elites consider all of them bigoted and stupid. Okay? And I don't think that generalization holds. I think a lot of people voted for Trump for a lot of reasons. But my implication was when you move from criticizing to Trump to making derogatory generalizations about everyone who voted for him, you are doing his work. Okay? So that's not an actual position it's not like an editorial position, but I think it's the case. And in any event, it's a case where just like the main point is, remember, when you do this, people who hear it, not that a ton of Trump supporters listen to NPR perhaps, but people who hear this kind of thing think, yeah, that's why I voted for Trump. So you fancy East Coasters consider me stupid.
So how can folks square, folks who want to resist, who want to organize people to oust Trump and stop Trumpism, how do you square trying to confront hatred, confront racism, and not be passive about it? Feel like you think how can I end racism if I don't confront it? With not alienating people who, if they're not actively racist, have at minimum abetted it or excused it by electing this guy and feel somewhat defensive about him.
Well, again, we're not going to be prescriptive in a fine-grained way, but it's funny. One thing that somebody said writing about Antifa is like, if you say to people who support Nazi punching that you're against it, they say, or if you say that in Charlottesville maybe Antifa was a problem, they say, oh, so you're saying the Nazis aren't to blame? Well, that's a total non sequitur, and it's very much like when I say, ISIS wouldn't exist if we hadn't invaded Iraq, and they're saying, oh, and then from the right you hear, oh, you're saying the terrorists aren't to blame? My point there, this may seem like a digression, but my point there is that, if the left is going to say you have to focus, you have to at least look at the root causes in one context, right? Well, that you have to be willing to step back and just look at the dynamics of how the problem got momentum in a dispassionate way in one realm, like terrorism, which I'm in favor of. You should do it in the other realm as well. And I would say, in terms of combating racism, again, we're not going to get prescriptive, but I just want to clear the path for an open discussion of it. And I mean, another good example is Mark Lillett, who said that identity politics is a problem. I don't know if he's right, but I think he should get a respectful hearing. He's a serious person throwing a theory out there about what the root causes of Trumpism may be, and we should look at the argument. I don't know. I'm not like on his side, and I think he's probably gotten I don't know how respectful a hearing he's got. I haven't paid attention, but I mean, probably with him, there's been a certain amount of this reflexive rejection. This couldn't be true. We don't want it to be true, and I don't know if it's true, but I am in favor of the dispassionate consideration of any serious hypothesis about the root causes of racism, terrorism, Trumpism, or any other ism I'm not in favor of.
So how can folks sign up to get the Mindful Resistance newsletter?
You go to mindfulresistance.net and sign up, and you will get it.
Excellent.
Like a growing number of people are.
And how can people get the New York Times bestseller, Why Buddhism is True?
For a while there was a problem I was kind of happy to have, which is that Amazon was out of stock, but I think they're in stock now. So that's one place. But your independent bookstores, if you got one, or for that matter, a chain store. I'm not against Barnes and Noble either. But I like to think it's an accessible, very accessible introduction to not just what the mindfulness meditation thing is about, but how it's actually connected to Buddhist philosophy. So this is not just about the therapeutic benefits of mindfulness. It's mainly, it's about how the way people do mindfulness meditation is actually authentically connected to the Buddhist claim that you can clarify your vision through meditation and be a happier person and build a better world. Who's against that?
And we be on the road promoting the book?
Yeah, if people want to see the schedule, I'm going to the West Coast. I did Boston, Washington already. I'm going to the West Coast in right after Labor Day, and Colorado, Oregon, Washington, California. And that schedule is at whybuddhismistrue.net. If you click events.
Fantastic. Well, it's been an honor to have you on the DMZ.
Thank you for the plug opportunities. I know I have failed to fill Matt's shoes in many ways, but maybe I'll get to stay in a swanky hotel on the book tour, and that would be like being a cable news star.
Exactly.
So I'm doing what I can.
I hope we can have you back soon.
I do too, but not. It's an occasion I'm sad about. I hope it'll be for some reason other than Matt's absence. Maybe we'll the three of us will get together online sometime.
That'd be fantastic.
Thank you, Bill.
Take care.
Keep it up. DMZ is doing God's work.
Appreciate that.